It was the kind of rain that didn't let up. A steady, heavy downpour, thick enough to make the trees seem like shadows against the sky. I had been driving for hours, my hands aching from gripping the wheel too tight. The roads were slick, winding through the dense forest of southern France, far from any town or city. I was heading to an old cabin that had been in my family for decades, tucked away in the woods near a lake. I had been there before, years ago, but never alone. The plan had been simple: get some time away from everything. Work had been wearing me down, and I needed space to clear my head. The cabin was the perfect place. Isolated, quiet, nothing but trees and water. I had stocked up on food and supplies in a small village earlier that day, knowing there wouldn't be any stores nearby. By the time I reached the cabin, the rain had turned the dirt path leading to it into a mess of mud and puddles. The trees pressed in on both sides of the road, their branches bending under the weight of the water. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing the small wooden structure at the end of the path. It looked the same as I remembered: weathered logs, a slanted roof, a single window with wooden shutters. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof of the car. There was no other sound. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the rain and the faint creaking of the trees in the wind. Grabbing my bag from the passenger seat, I pushed the door open and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, soaking through my jacket as I made my way up the small steps onto the porch. The key was exactly where my father had always left it, under a loose board near the door. My fingers were stiff as I unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and dust. The cabin was small, just one main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a door leading to the bedroom. The furniture was old but sturdy, the kind that had been there for generations. A thick layer of dust covered everything, untouched for who knows how long. I set my bag down near the fireplace and went back outside to grab more supplies from the car. The rain hadn't slowed, and by the time I was done, I was drenched. I locked the door behind me and lit one of the old oil lamps on the table. The glow flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the flame. The rain kept coming. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. I busied myself, setting up my things, making a small fire in the fireplace to chase away the damp. As the cabin warmed, I started to relax. The sound of the rain was almost soothing now, a steady rhythm against the roof. Hours passed. I ate a simple meal, read a few pages of an old book I had brought, then finally decided to turn in for the night. The bedroom was just as dusty as the rest of the cabin, but the bed was still intact. The mattress was thin, but after the long drive, I didn't care. I lay there, listening to the rain, letting my body sink into the mattress. Sleep came slowly, my mind still half alert to every sound outside. Then something changed. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. The rain was still falling, but it was different now, softer, more distant. What had woken me wasn't the rain. It was something else. I stayed still, my breathing shallow. The fire in the other room had died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the darkness. The wind had settled, but I could hear something quiet, just beyond the cabin walls. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not heavy, but not light either. Someone or something was moving outside. I lay there, my heart pounding, ears straining. The sound came again, closer this time, wet footsteps against the wooden porch. My hand tightened around the handle of the hunting knife I always carried. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another step, then another, then silence. I counted the seconds in my head, forcing myself to stay still. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. Slowly, I moved, shifting just enough to look toward the bedroom door. The cabin was pitch dark, the last embers of the fire barely giving off any light. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A thief? Someone from the village nearby? But no one would be out here in this weather. Not at this hour. I stayed there, gripping the knife, listening. The rain had softened to a drizzle, making every sound outside more distinct. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it again. But this time it wasn't outside. It was inside. A slow, careful step on the wooden floor of the main room. I stopped breathing. My grip on the knife was so tight my fingers ached. Another step. Closer. I moved as silently as I could, slipping out of bed. My feet touched the cold floor. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. The cabin was small. Whoever was in there was only a few steps away. The door wasn't locked from the inside. Had they picked the lock? Forced it open while I slept? I had to act fast. With one deep breath, I moved. I stepped forward, pushing the bedroom door open just enough to see. The dim glow from the dying embers gave the room a faint red hue. My eyes adjusted, scanning the space. The door was still shut. The shutters on the windows were closed. But the air felt different, charged, tense. Then I saw it. The wet footprints, darkened patches on the wooden floor, leading from the door to the center of the room. They were fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching. And then, just as I took another step forward, the silence shattered. The front door swung open with a crash, slamming against the wall. The wind howled in, rain spraying across the floor. I ran forward, gripping my knife, my pulse hammering. I reached the doorway and looked out into the night. Nothing, just the rain, the trees, the darkness stretching out beyond the cabin. Whoever had been there was gone. I locked the door, checked the windows, searched every corner of the cabin. Nothing was missing. No sign of forced entry, just those footprints. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening to the rain. The sun couldn't come up fast enough. By morning, the storm had passed. The forest was still, the ground thick with mud. I packed my things, threw everything into the car, and left without looking back. I never went back to that cabin again. And I never figured out who or what had been inside that night. I had no reason to take that road, but I did. It had been years since I last saw my ex-husband's cabin. The place never meant much to me, not really. He had it long before we met, and even when we were together, he always treated it as his own little world, one I was only ever visiting. It was a place where he went to be alone, a retreat from everything and everyone, including me. When we split, I didn't even think about it. He kept it, and I let it fade from my mind. But that day, I found myself heading down that old road, the one that cut through miles of empty land before reaching the tree line. I didn't plan it. I was just driving, taking the long way home, trying to clear my head after a week that had drained me. It had been raining earlier, but now the sky was only gray, heavy with thick clouds that stretched low over the trees. I had the radio off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the wet pavement and the occasional thud of water dripping from the trees onto the windshield. The further I went, the more I felt that strange pull in my chest. It wasn't nostalgia. I had no fond memories of that place. It was something else, something heavier. I didn't even notice I was slowing down until I saw the break in the trees. The narrow dirt path was still there, half hidden by overgrown grass and weeds. It looked worse than I remembered. Rough, uneven, barely a road at all anymore. I should have kept driving, but I didn't. I turned onto the path, the tires sinking slightly into the damp earth. The car rocked as I went over deep ruts, the undercarriage scraping against loose rocks. The further in I went, the thicker the trees grew, swallowing what little light was left. And then I saw it. The cabin was still standing, but just barely. The roof sagged, the wood was dark with rot, and the front steps were broken, one of them lying sideways in the dirt. The windows were dark, streaked with grime. It looked abandoned, except something was off. The door was closed, but I could see faint marks in the dirt in front of it. Tracks, but not from a car. It looked like someone had been walking back and forth, pacing, but the rain had blurred the prints, making it impossible to tell how recent they were. I should have turned around, but something made me step out of the car. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of wet wood and earth. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no birds, just silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I took a few steps closer, my boots sinking into the mud. The place felt wrong, not just abandoned, but watched. I could feel it, that weight of unseen eyes pressing in from the trees, from the darkened windows, from somewhere just out of sight. I told myself I was being stupid, but then I saw it. The lock on the front door was broken. Not rusted, not old, broken. The metal was twisted, snapped like someone had forced their way in. The wood around the latch was splintered, fresh and jagged. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. My gut told me to leave. I backed up slowly, not turning my back on the cabin. Every step felt too loud, and then I saw the curtain move, just a fraction, just enough to know that I hadn't imagined it. I turned and walked as fast as I could without running. My breath was coming too fast, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The car was only a few steps away. I reached for the handle. That was when I heard it. Not a voice, not words, just movement. A single step on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. The silence outside stretched long, too long. And then another step, this time on the gravel. I didn't wait. I started the engine, my foot already pressing down on the gas. The tires spun for a split second in the mud before they caught, jerking the car forward. I didn't look back. I forced myself to focus on the road, on getting out of there, but every nerve in my body was screaming at me to go faster. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the thick trees, the abandoned cabin that I should have never gone back to. I don't know who was in there. I don't want to know, but someone was, and they were watching me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they weren't surprised to see me. They were expecting me, and that scares me more than anything. I had been living in the old hunting cabin for a little over 3 months when the first sign of something wrong appeared. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle, who had passed away the previous year. I had come out there to clear my head, to get away from everything for a while. Life had gotten too loud, too complicated, and I needed space to breathe. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of northern Montana. The closest town was nearly an hour's drive away, and even then it was just a small, dying place with a few stores and a single gas station. The only road leading to the cabin was a narrow dirt path that cut through miles of dense forest. It wasn't the kind of place people stumbled upon. I had spent the first couple of months enjoying the solitude. The air was clean, the nights were quiet except for the wind through the trees, and I had learned to appreciate the simple life. Chopping firewood, fishing in the nearby creek, hunting when I needed fresh meat. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. The first thing that happened was small. I found tracks around the cabin that didn't make sense. At first, I thought they were coyote tracks, but they were too big. Then I figured they might belong to a wolf, but something about them was off. They weren't quite paw prints. They were too elongated, too thin, like something had been walking on its toes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I had misidentified them. But then other things started happening. One night, I was sitting inside, reading by the fire, when I heard something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creak of the trees. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside onto the porch, but the moment I did, the noise stopped. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I walked around the cabin, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Just the trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. That was the first time I felt it, the sense that I wasn't alone out there. After that, things escalated. I started hearing noises at night, scratching at the walls, breathing just outside my window. I kept the doors locked, the rifle by my bed, but it didn't help. One morning, I found deep gouges in the wooden beams of the cabin's exterior, like something had been clawing at it. The tracks had returned, circling the place over and over again, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. I was starting to get uneasy. One afternoon, I went out to check the snares I had set along the tree line, and I found something that made my stomach drop. One of the rabbits I had caught was hanging from a low branch, gutted, its insides missing. It hadn't been eaten by an animal. There were no bite marks, no sign of scavengers. It had been cut open, cleanly. Something was playing with me. That night, I stayed up, watching the tree lean through the cabin's small front window. The rifle was in my lap, my heart pounding in my chest. Around midnight, the noises started again. Soft shuffling, the occasional snap of a twig. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and thin, its arms hanging almost to its knees. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. It was watching me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, gripping the rifle so tightly my fingers ached. Eventually, the figure moved, not like a person, not like an animal. It shifted, its body twisting unnaturally, its limbs bending at wrong angles. Then it disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to be alone with anymore. I packed up what I could carry, loaded my truck, and started the long drive back to civilization. I made it about 5 miles before I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road, blocking my path. It hadn't been there before. The wood was fresh, the leaves still green. It hadn't fallen naturally. Someone or something had put it there. I turned around, my mind racing. I could take another road out, but it would take hours. I didn't have a choice. As I drove back toward the cabin, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Tall, thin, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the doors, pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed over the windows, and sat in the dark, rifle in hand. That night was the worst. The noises started early. Scratching at the walls, footsteps on the porch, something brushing against the windows. Then came the voices. Not real voices, mocking imitations of them. My uncle's voice, my mother's, my own, whispering from the darkness outside. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. At some point in the night, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the cabin was silent. The sun was just beginning to rise, a thin line of light breaking through the trees. I stood up slowly, my entire body aching from tension. And then I saw it, just outside, standing at the edge of the woods. It was still watching me, but this time it was smiling. It had my face. I don't remember much after that. I must have panicked, because the next thing I knew, I was in my truck, speeding down the dirt road, not caring about the fallen tree, not caring about anything but getting away. I didn't stop until I reached the town. I never went back. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I wonder if it ever really let me go. It was late October when I found myself driving through the winding back roads of northern England, heading toward a remote cabin I had rented for the week. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, the demands of work, and the endless notifications on my phone. I wanted silence. I wanted cold air, the sound of wind rustling through the trees, and the weight of heavy blankets at night. I had always enjoyed the loneliness of these trips, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just me and the wilderness. The cabin itself was an old structure, built sometime in the early 1900s, tucked away in the woods about a mile off a forgotten country road. It was small but sturdy, with thick wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a porch that overlooked the endless stretch of trees. It had no Wi-Fi, no television, and only a weak radio signal if you turned the dial just right. It was perfect. By the time I arrived, the sky was a heavy gray, and the wind had a sharp bite to it. The rain had started an hour ago and hadn't let up. Fat droplets pelted the windshield, making the trees and road blur together in streaks of brown and green. I pulled up to the cabin, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, watching the rain hit the dirt road and turn it to mud. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no distant hum of cars, just the wind and rain. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and made a quick dash to the front porch, fumbling with the keys before finally shoving the door open. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old pine. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. The cabin was exactly as I had imagined, bare but cozy. A small kitchen to the left, a single bedroom in the back, and a living room with a couch and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I set my bag down and walked to the window. The rain made it hard to see much of anything beyond the clearing in front of the cabin, but the forest stood still, dark, and heavy. It was exactly what I had wanted. That night, I slept deeply, wrapped in layers of blankets, listening to the rain hammer the roof. I didn't wake up until well past sunrise. The next few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, hiking the narrow trails behind the cabin, and chopping wood for the fireplace. The air was cold but refreshing, and the silence was exactly what I had needed. The only strange thing was that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things, like how the woods felt different every time I walked through them, or how the air felt too still at times, like something was waiting, or how I could swear I saw something move in the distance, just at the edge of my vision. By the third night, I had started to feel it more, the unease. It was around midnight when I woke up, unsure of what had pulled me from my sleep. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the wind outside had died completely. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were clear. Slow, deliberate steps on wet ground, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Then, another step. I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, clicking it on. The beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, but I forced myself to stand. I moved slowly toward the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then I saw her, a woman, standing just beyond the tree line. She was barely visible in the dim light, but she was there. Her clothes were dark, soaked from the rain, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, staring at the cabin. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was that she might be lost, maybe injured. But something about the way she stood, the stillness of it, made every instinct in me scream that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. I didn't turn my back to it, didn't look away. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then she moved, not toward the cabin, not away from it, just slightly, shifting her weight. Enough to make it clear she wasn't frozen. Enough to let me know that she knew I was watching. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen counter, my hands shaking. I had no reception out here, no way to call for help. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching her, waiting. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with thick clouds. I went outside, walking to the spot where she had stood. The ground was soaked and muddy, but there were no footprints. Nothing, just wet leaves and dirt. But I knew what I had seen. I packed my things that morning. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. I didn't care that there was probably a logical explanation. I just knew that I wasn't staying another night. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind me. But I never did, and I never went back. I had been in the army for over 15 years, stationed in different parts of the world, witnessing things most people would never believe. I had learned to trust my instincts, to rely on the routine of military life, and to never question orders too deeply. But there are things that no amount of training prepares you for. Things that don't make sense no matter how much you try to justify them. This story happened in 2012, somewhere deep in the forests of Montana. Our unit had been stationed at a remote training ground for a survival exercise. One of those grueling endurance tests that involved days of isolation, rations, and navigating through dense wilderness. It was designed to break you, to make you feel completely alone before you proved yourself capable of enduring the worst. We were split into small groups and sent off in different directions, each with a map, a compass, and just enough supplies to last a few days. My group consisted of 4 men: myself, Sergeant Taylor, Private Burke, and Lieutenant Mason. Mason was our commanding officer for the exercise, an older, hardened soldier with a reputation for being strict but fair. Taylor and Burke were younger, still full of that eagerness to prove themselves. The first couple of days went as expected. We navigated through the rough terrain, setting up small camps at night and pushing forward by daylight. The days were long, exhausting, but manageable. It wasn't until the 3rd day that things started to feel off. We had been moving through thick woods, heading toward a designated checkpoint, when we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It wasn't on the map, and there was no indication that it should be here. The structure was worn down, its wooden planks splintered and cracked from years of neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the front door was slightly ajar, swinging lightly with the wind. Mason was the first to decide we should check it out. It was against protocol. Our mission was to complete the exercise, not to explore unknown locations, but he was adamant. "Might be useful," he said, though I didn't understand what he meant at the time. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a deep unease settle in my gut. The interior was sparse: dusty furniture, old cabinets, a rusted stove in the corner. There were signs that someone had once lived here. Empty cans stacked in a corner, a rotting mattress on the floor. But whoever had stayed here was long gone. Mason made the call to rest here for the night. It was an unnecessary risk. Our designated route had safe camping spots, and this place felt wrong. But he outranked us and we followed orders. That night, I barely slept. The cabin creaked with the wind. The air felt too thick, too silent. At some point, I heard Mason and Taylor whispering in the other room, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It didn't sit right with me, but I pushed it aside. The next morning, I woke up to find Burke missing. At first, we thought he had wandered off to relieve himself, but after an hour passed, we knew something was wrong. We searched the perimeter, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. No tracks, no footprints leading away. It was as if he had vanished. Mason barely reacted. He just told us to pack up and move. I protested. Protocol dictated that we report a missing soldier immediately, but he shut me down quickly. "It's just part of the exercise," he said. "Burke will find his way back." But something in his tone was wrong. Too casual, too sure. We left the cabin, but the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mason knew something we didn't. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing. Without Burke, the mood was heavy, but Mason carried on like nothing had happened. Taylor, on the other hand, was quiet. I caught him watching Mason several times, his face tense, as if he wanted to say something but was holding back. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening. At some point, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not from the woods, but from within the camp. I lay still, barely breathing. Then I heard it. Mason's voice, low and steady, and Taylor's voice shaking. "I won't say anything," Taylor whispered. "I swear." There was a pause, then a soft rustling sound, then silence. I waited, my heart pounding, until I was sure it was safe to move. Then, as quietly as I could, I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. Taylor was gone. Mason was sitting by the fire, alone. He didn't even flinch when the light hit him. He just looked at me, his face unreadable. "Go back to sleep," he said. I didn't. At dawn, Mason acted like nothing was wrong. He packed his gear, checked his map, and started walking. I followed, my body tense, my mind racing. I knew now. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but I knew Mason was behind it. Burke, Taylor, they were gone, and he was the only one left. We walked in silence for hours. The deeper we went into the woods, the more I realized something terrifying. We weren't heading toward the checkpoint. We were heading back to the cabin. I stopped walking. "We're going the wrong way." Mason turned, his face calm. "We're finishing the exercise." I didn't move. For the first time in my life, I felt real fear. Not the fear of combat, not the fear of failure, but the fear of being truly alone with someone dangerous. I had a knife. I had my training. But I knew that if I made a move, I wouldn't survive. So I played along. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. Mason stepped inside like he belonged there, like this was his home. I stayed at the doorway, my muscles tight. That's when I saw it. The floorboards were stained dark. Not with dirt, not with water, with blood. Burke's backpack was in the corner. Taylor's rifle leaned against the wall. Mason sat down on the old mattress, watching me. "You already know," he said. I stayed still. He tilted his head, as if considering something. Then slowly he pulled out his knife. And that's when I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. Through the trees, through the dark. I didn't care about direction, about protocol. I just needed to get away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. A road, a car, civilization. I never went back. I never spoke about it. Mason was reported missing a week later, along with Burke and Taylor. The Army investigated, but the case was quietly closed. No bodies were ever found. But I know the truth, and somewhere, Deep in that forest, the cabin still stands, waiting. I should have turned down the job. It was the middle of October, cold enough that you could see your breath at night, but not quite winter yet. The air had that damp chill that clung to your clothes, the kind that seeps into your bones after a while. I had been working construction for a while, mostly small jobs, renovations, house repairs, things like that. But when my boss, a guy named Mark, asked me to help build his new hunting cabin deep in the woods, I figured it would be an easy paycheck. The location was far out. Mark had bought a patch of land about 40 miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no power lines, just woods, dirt roads, and a half-finished cabin. The kind of place you'd only go if you really wanted to be alone. I drove out there early in the morning, my truck bouncing along the unpaved roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was barely up, a dim orange glow filtering through the trees. The cabin itself was just a shell. Wooden frame, unfinished walls, no doors or windows installed yet. Mark had dropped off all the materials the day before, but I was the only one scheduled to work that day. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for me to work alone. I liked it, actually, no distractions, no one to slow me down. But as I stepped out of my truck and looked around, I got this weird feeling in my gut. The kind of feeling you get when you know something's off, but you can't put your finger on it. Maybe it was just the silence. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead air. I shook it off, grabbed my tool belt, and got to work. The plan was simple. Install the windows and doors, finish up some interior framing, and if I had time, start on the roof supports. Mark wanted the place done fast, and he was paying extra for overtime. The first couple of hours went by without a hitch. I worked steadily, measuring and cutting, my breath fogging in the crisp morning air. The only sound was the occasional creak of wood and the rhythmic thud of my hammer. By noon, I had the first set of windows installed. That's when I started noticing things. Little things at first, like how my truck, parked a good 20 feet away, looked like it had shifted slightly in the dirt. I figured maybe I just hadn't parked it as straight as I thought. Then, as I was reaching for my measuring tape, I realized it wasn't where I left it. It was on the opposite side of the cabin, near the stack of lumber. I chalked it up to me just being absent-minded, grabbed it, and kept working. But then, a little while later, I heard something, a rustling in the trees just beyond the clearing. I stopped hammering and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I went back to work, but that feeling, that weird, uneasy feeling, didn't go away. By mid-afternoon, I was up on a ladder, securing the frame for the last window, when I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate. They stopped the second I stopped hammering. I turned my head, scanning the trees. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but something about it didn't feel right. I stayed still for a minute, listening, but everything was quiet again. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was alone in the woods, after all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I went back to work. The sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. Still had a couple more hours of daylight left. I figured I could finish the doors before packing up. As I worked, that feeling of being watched only got worse. Every now and then, I'd hear a sound, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. I started working faster, wanting to get the job done before dark. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, not mine, fresh ones in the dirt near my truck. They were too big to be from an animal, and they weren't there earlier. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my truck while I was working. I looked around again, heart pounding. Still no one in sight. I wasn't about to wait around to see who it was. I packed up my tools, locked up what I could, and threw everything in my truck. Just as I was about to get in, I saw something that stopped me cold. A single handprint on the driver's side window, smudged but fresh, not mine. I stood there for a second, gripping my toolbox so hard my knuckles turned white. Then I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove faster than I should have, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. The sun was almost gone now, the trees on either side of me turning into dark, shifting shapes. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the main road. My hands were still shaking when I finally pulled into town. I called Mark as soon as I had service. He laughed it off, said it was probably just some hunters passing through. I wanted to believe him, but something about that place didn't sit right with me. I didn't go back the next day, or the day after. Mark finished the cabin himself. A few weeks later, he called me again, told me someone had broken in. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged, just a single smudged handprint on the inside of the window. I never planned to spend the night in that old cabin. It was supposed to be a quick stop, an hour, maybe two, just enough time to rest my legs and get my bearings before heading back to the truck. But things don't always go as planned, and that night proved it. It was late October, the kind of cold where the air bites at your skin, and the dampness creeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I had been hiking all afternoon through the thick woods, following what was supposed to be an old logging road. My map, worn and creased from years of use, showed the road cutting straight through the valley and leading to a clearing where I could set up camp. But either the map was wrong or I had misread it because the road had all but disappeared under decades of overgrowth. By the time I realized my mistake, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in streaks of deep orange and purple. I checked my phone, no signal, no surprise there. I had known going in that I would be out of range. That was part of the appeal. A few days of solitude, no emails, no calls, no one to bother me. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The quiet. That was the first thing that had started to feel off. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The exhaustion from hiking all day was messing with my head. But as I stood there in the middle of the thick woods, deciding what to do next, I realized how truly silent it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of water running through a creek, just the stillness. I forced myself to shake it off. I had two choices: either set up camp right there, in the middle of the thick brush, or keep moving and hope I found a clearing before it got too dark to see. Neither option was ideal, but as I weighed them, I noticed something ahead. A structure. At first, I thought it was an old hunting shack, maybe something a trapper had built years ago and abandoned. But as I got closer, I saw the shape of a tall iron fence just beyond it, its bars rusted and twisted. A graveyard. It was small, maybe a dozen graves at most, their stones weathered and leaning from years of neglect. Some had fallen over entirely, half buried under leaves and dirt. The iron fence surrounding it was broken in places, bent as if something had forced its way through. I didn't like the look of it, but I liked the thought of spending the night out in the open even less. The cabin sat just a few yards from the edge of the graveyard, tucked beneath a heavy canopy of trees. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging in places, but it looked sturdy enough. If it had been used in the past few decades, there was no sign of it. No path leading up to the door, no markings, nothing but the forest slowly reclaiming it. I hesitated at the threshold. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside swallowing the last bit of daylight. I didn't want to go in, but the cold was already settling in, and I didn't have much choice. The cabin was shelter, and I needed it. The inside was worse than I expected. Dust coated every surface. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. There was a small fireplace against the back wall, filled with old, crumbling logs that had long since turned to dust. A wooden chair sat in the middle of the room, its legs uneven on the warped floorboards. And on the far side of the cabin, against the wall, was a narrow bed frame with the remnants of a mattress still clinging to it. I dropped my pack near the door and pulled out my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the walls. Scratches. Deep, uneven scratches carved into the wood, running along the length of the cabin like something had clawed at it. Not animal scratches either. They were too precise, too deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, just marks from the wood settling, maybe some old damage from long ago. I had spent enough nights in the woods to know that old places had a way of wearing down in strange ways. But I didn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The silence was thick, pressing down on me. Every so often, I would hear something. A soft creak, the whisper of wind against the broken windows. But there was no wind. The trees outside were still. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark, but something was wrong. The cabin door was open. I was certain I had closed it. Not locked, it didn't have a lock, but I had shut it tight. Now it stood open a few inches, revealing nothing but the inky black of the forest beyond. I sat up slowly, my breath tight in my chest. My flashlight was still in my hand, and I clicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the doorway. Nothing, just trees and darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not close but not far either, coming from beyond the graveyard, past the rusted fence. Slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but deep down I knew better. Animals don't move like that. They don't stop and start as if they're waiting for something. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps never came closer, but they never fully left, either. As soon as the first hint of light touched the trees, I packed up my things. The door was still open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. I stepped outside, my breath misting in the cold air, and looked toward the graveyard. The footprints were there, not fresh but not old either. They led from the far edge of the fence, through the graveyard, stopping just a few feet from the cabin door. Then they disappeared. No trail leading away, no signs of movement beyond that point. Just the disturbed leaves and the empty space where something had stood, watching. I didn't wait to find out more. I left the cabin behind, moving fast, barely stopping to check my bearings. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, where the trees thinned and I could see the sky again. I never went back, never tried to find that cabin again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear those footsteps. I was never the type to believe in bad luck. People make their own choices and things either go right or they don't. That's how I saw it. But after what happened with that cabin, I started to think some places just have something wrong with them from the start. It was late September when I found the listing. A small cabin, about an hour outside of town, tucked away in a valley near an old logging trail. The price was too good to ignore. It wasn't some historic relic, just a simple structure built in 1998 by a guy who wanted a hunting lodge. The description said it needed some repairs but was solid. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet place I could fix up on my own, something I could turn into a weekend retreat. I should have known better when I saw how fast the realtor rushed the sale. No back and forth, no haggling. Just a handshake, some paperwork, and a warning about the road leading up to it, how it could be rough in bad weather. I brushed it off. The place was mine, and I was eager to get started. The drive up was quiet. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt path, barely visible from the road. Thick trees pressed in on both sides, making it feel like the world ended at the tree line. When I stepped out of my truck, everything was still. Too still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. The cabin itself was small, one story with a steep roof. The logs were aged but intact. The windows had thick shutters, all bolted down tight. A single door, heavy and made of reinforced wood, stood at the front. There was no sign of forced entry, no vandalism. Just a structure that had been left alone for a long time. Inside, it smelled stale. The air was thick with dust, and a thin layer of dirt coated the wooden floorboards. There were no signs of pests or squatters, but the place felt abandoned in a way that made my skin crawl. The furniture was basic, old chairs, a cot, and a small table. The previous owner had left behind a few tools and supplies, mostly rusted and useless. In the back was a narrow hallway leading to a storage room and a small bathroom. As I walked through, I noticed something odd. The nails in the walls were newer than the wood around them. At some point, someone had reinforced the place, replacing older nails with stronger ones. The more I looked, the more I realized the whole structure had been reinforced. Extra bolts in the shutters, thick locks on the cabinets. Even the hinges on the door had been replaced with something industrial. It didn't make sense. This was just a hunting cabin. Why go through the trouble? The first night, I slept in my truck. I told myself it was just because I hadn't brought a proper bed yet. But the truth was, something about the cabin made me uneasy. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the trees weren't moving. Then I heard it again. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It came from near the back of the cabin. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound stopped, replaced by the creak of wood. Not just any wood, floorboards shifting under weight. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the cabin's back wall. Nothing, just the same old logs and darkness beyond. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind or an animal passing through. But when morning came, I found something that made my stomach drop. The dirt behind the cabin had been disturbed. A long, shallow groove stretched from the tree lean to the cabin's back wall, stopping right near the storage room, like something had been dragged through the dirt. I checked the cabin, but nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just that long mark in the ground. I almost left that morning. Something in my gut told me to, but I had already spent money on the place, and I wasn't about to let my nerves get the best of me. I told myself I was being paranoid. A few days later, I started cleaning up the inside. The storage room was my main focus. It was small, with nothing but a few empty shelves and an old tool chest. But as I was sweeping, my boot hit something hollow. I knelt down and ran my hand over the floor. The wood was uneven. I grabbed a crowbar and pried at the planks, expecting to find old insulation or wiring. Instead, I found a trapdoor. It was made of the same wood as the floor, but reinforced with thick steel latches. Took some effort, but I got it open. A steep wooden staircase led down into darkness. The air that rushed up was damp and stale. I hesitated, then grabbed my flashlight and started down. The steps groaned under my weight, but they held. At the bottom was a small room. The walls were lined with wooden beams, the floor covered in packed dirt. In the corner, a pile of old blankets and clothing was stacked against the wall. Nearby, deep scratches marked the wooden beams, jagged and uneven. The worst part? The door. There was another door built into the back wall, made of thick steel. It had been welded shut from the outside. Someone had sealed this place off. I felt my stomach twist. I turned back, climbed the stairs, and closed the trapdoor. That night, I locked every window and door. I barely slept. Every noise made my pulse spike. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again, soft footsteps, moving just beyond the tree line. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The steps circled the cabin, moving closer. Then, a sound I'll never forget. 3 slow knocks on the back wall. I gripped my knife, heart pounding. The knocks came again. 3 slow, deliberate. Then silence. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I finally stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Bare feet, leading from the trees to the cabin's back wall. They stopped just below the storage room, right above the trapdoor. I should have left. I knew that, but some stubborn part of me wanted to see it through. That night, I barricaded the trapdoor. I didn't sleep. At some point, I heard movement, not outside, inside. A soft creak like someone shifting their weight. Then the trapdoor rattled. Something was beneath the floor, pushing against it. The latches strained, but held. Then silence. I didn't wait until morning. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and left. I never went back. I sold the cabin at a loss. Didn't care. A few months later, I looked up the original owner. He had vanished in 1999, just disappeared. No family, no explanation. I don't know who or what was in that cabin before me, but I know one thing. Someone built that trapdoor for a reason, and someone at some point tried to keep something locked inside. I had never planned on owning a cabin. It just sort of happened. The land belonged to my uncle, or at least it had before he passed. A small, single-story place set deep in the high desert of New Mexico, where the red dust never quite settled, and the wind howled through the sagebrush at night like some living thing. It had been his retreat from the world, a place he had built himself, board by board, until he had a home away from everything. I hadn't been particularly close to him. He was the kind of man who spent more time in the wilderness than in town, and by the time I was old enough to really know him, he had already become more of a mystery than a relative. When I got the call from the lawyer saying I had inherited his property, I had no idea what to do with it. I had barely even been to that part of New Mexico before, but the idea of a quiet escape, somewhere away from the noise of my life, was tempting. I drove out there in early November. The land was barren, save for the occasional squat trees and rolling hills, the kind of landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. The cabin was in decent shape, despite the years of neglect. It had a tin roof, a porch that wrapped around the front, and a single stone chimney that looked like it had been built to last 100 years. The inside was simple: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a living room with a few old chairs that had probably been there since the place was built. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old well out back, half covered in brush, and a rusting generator in the shed that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. The place smelled like dust and wood, like something abandoned, something waiting to be lived in again. I had brought supplies: canned food, bottled water, a lantern, and a sleeping bag, but I hadn't planned on staying long. Just enough to check things out, see if it was worth fixing up. Maybe I'd sell it, maybe I'd keep it as a weekend retreat. The first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little noise. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind shifting against the walls, the scratch of dry branches against the roof. I had a small fire going in the wood stove, enough to keep the chill out of the air. I sat on the porch for a while, staring out into the dark, listening. There were no city sounds, no traffic, no voices, just the distant call of a coyote somewhere beyond the hills. I should have left then. The next morning, I decided to explore the land a bit. The property stretched for a few acres, mostly empty space, but there were signs of life. Old footprints near the well, long faded. A rusted-out truck sitting in the weeds behind the shed. A pile of firewood, freshly chopped, stacked near the back wall of the cabin. I hadn't chopped it. That was the first thing that set me on edge. The second was the feeling, the sensation that I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to nerves. A city guy out in the middle of nowhere, not used to the silence, not used to the way the land felt empty and full at the same time. I told myself I was being stupid, that the firewood was probably just something my uncle had left before he passed, and I hadn't noticed it the night before. But then I found the tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints, fresh ones in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I checked the door, the windows, but everything was locked. Nothing inside had been touched. But that feeling, that creeping, skin-prickling feeling, stayed with me. I decided to stay another night. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stubbornness. I told myself I'd set up a few traps, see if it was just an animal. I had some fishing line in my bag, and I used it to rig up a simple tripwire around the porch. Nothing serious, just enough to wake me up if something moved too close. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something outside. Footsteps? The wind? I wasn't sure. Then, just before dawn, the tripwire snapped. I sat up so fast I nearly hit my head on the wall. The fire in the stove had died down. The room was ice cold. I grabbed the lantern, turned it on, and moved slowly to the window. Nothing. I stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. The wire was broken, snapped clean in the middle. Something or someone had stepped through it, but there were no footprints, no sign of anything moving in the dirt. I should have packed up then and there. Instead, I convinced myself it was the wind, that the wire had been old, brittle. I told myself I'd imagined the footsteps, that I was just worked up from being alone in an unfamiliar place. I spent the next day fixing up small things around the cabin, trying to distract myself. But the feeling never went away. That sensation, like I was being watched. By sunset, I had made up my mind. I was leaving the next morning. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and sat with my back against the wall, facing the entrance. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of breathing, not my own. Slow, steady breaths, just outside the cabin door. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe myself. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The door handle moved, not shaking, not rattling, just a slow, deliberate turn. Testing. The lock held. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving along the porch. Then silence. I waited until dawn before I moved. When I finally stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the footprints. They circled the cabin. Once, twice, again and again. But they never led away. I left that morning. I never went back. I had been driving for hours. The rain had started as a light drizzle, but now it was hammering down on my windshield, making it hard to see. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing water across the glass instead of clearing it. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but wet road and trees on either side. It was late, past midnight, and I was exhausted. I was heading to an old hunting cabin my uncle had built years ago. It was deep in the woods, far from the main roads, a place where he used to take me when I was a kid. After he passed, the cabin was left to me. I never really used it, but with everything in my life falling apart lately, I needed to get away. Work had been a nightmare. My relationship was over. and I couldn't remember the last time I had a full night's sleep. The idea of being alone in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. The road was getting worse, narrow, full of potholes barely maintained. I knew I was getting close. I turned off onto a smaller dirt road, the tires slipping slightly in the mud. The trees closed in on both sides, branches scraping against the side of my truck. There were no streetlights out here, just my headlights and the occasional flicker of lightning in the sky. I finally saw it, the old wooden cabin, barely visible in the dark. It was exactly how I remembered it. Small, weathered, with a slanted roof and a porch that looked like it was ready to collapse. I pulled up, turned off the truck, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. The wind was howling through the trees, making them sway. The storm was getting worse. I grabbed my bag and made a run for the door. The key was still hidden under the loose plank on the porch. I fumbled with it, my hands numb from the cold rain. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, dripping wet. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of damp wood and dust. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. Not surprising. I found the old oil lamp on the shelf and lit it. The soft glow filled the small room, casting shadows on the walls. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the corner, a single bed against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bathroom that barely had enough space to turn around in. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. It was quiet, peaceful even. The rain drummed against the roof, and the wind rattled the windows, but inside, it felt safe. I pulled off my wet jacket, hung it over a chair, and started a fire in the wood stove. The warmth spread slowly, cutting through the chill. I was exhausted, but I wanted to check the place over before I got some sleep. I grabbed the lamp and walked around. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. Old hunting gear still hanging on the walls, a stack of firewood by the stove, the same dusty furniture. I glanced out the window, just darkness. The trees swayed violently in the wind, but nothing else moved. I locked the door, double-checking the latch. Out here, you never knew what kind of animals might try to get inside. I sat on the bed and pulled off my boots, letting out a long breath. My body ached from the drive. The rain was still hammering down outside, the wind howling through the trees. I closed my eyes, just for a second. A noise woke me up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but this was different. A sharp, distinct sound, a creak, like someone had stepped on a loose floorboard. I sat up, heart pounding. The lamp was still flickering on the table. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving only glowing embers. I listened, holding my breath. Silence. I told myself it was nothing. The cabin was old, creaked and groaned in the wind, but something felt off. I reached under the bed, pulling out the old hunting knife my uncle had left behind. I stood up slowly, the floor cold under my bare feet. The cabin felt different, like something was wrong. I took a step toward the window and peered outside. The rain had let up a little, but it was still dark. The trees swayed in the wind. Nothing else moved. Then I saw them, a set of footprints in the mud, fresh, leading from the trees to the porch. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. Someone had been here, recently. I turned, scanning the room. The door was still locked. The windows were shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved toward the kitchen area, keeping the knife tight in my grip. I checked the back door, still locked. The windows, nothing broken, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it again, a soft creak, this time from inside the cabin. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned slowly, raising the lamp. The flickering light cast shadows across the walls. Then I saw it, a figure, standing in the far corner of the room. Tall, motionless, watching me. My body froze. I hadn't seen him when I walked in. Had he been there the whole time? Hiding? I gripped the knife tighter. My mind raced. The door was behind me. If I moved fast enough, I could make it. Then he took a step forward. I lunged for the door, but he was faster. A hand grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back. I swung the knife blindly, feeling it connect with something solid. A grunt. The grip loosened for half a second, just enough for me to rip free. I crashed into the table, knocking the lamp over. The flame flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my hands searching for anything I could use. I could hear him breathing, moving. I backed up, feeling the wall against my spine. Then the front door burst open. The wind howled in, rain slamming against the floor. In the flash of lightning, I saw him. Tall, ragged clothes, a knife in his hand, blood dripping from his arm where I had cut him. I didn't think. I ran. I hit the door at full speed, barely feeling the impact as I crashed outside. My feet slipped in the mud, but I didn't stop. I ran for the truck, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Then I saw him, standing on the porch, watching me. The truck roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, tires spinning in the mud. I didn't look back. I just drove. I don't remember how long I drove. I just kept going until I hit the main road. I never went back to the cabin. The next day, the police found the place broken into, blood on the floor, my footprints and someone else's, but no sign of the man. Whoever he was, he had been in there the whole time, watching me, waiting. I remember the night well. It was one of those cold, damp evenings where the rain never really poured, just misted the air enough to seep into your clothes and make everything feel heavier. I was up in the mountains, in a cabin I had owned for a few years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place I had built myself over time, mostly with reclaimed wood and whatever I could afford. It had taken me years to finish, but it was mine. I wasn't expecting to be there that night. Originally, I had planned to come up the following week, but something about the city had felt suffocating lately. Work had been stressful, and I needed to clear my head. The mountains always did that for me. No noise, no people, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of some animal in the underbrush. The road up had been rougher than usual. The last storm had knocked a few trees down, and the dirt path leading to the cabin had turned into deep, muddy ruts. My truck struggled through the worst of it, slipping now and then, but I made it. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the door. It was open, not wide open, just enough that it wasn't latched anymore. The wind nudged it every so often, making it creak. That wasn't how I had left it. I was always careful about locking up. The cabin was too remote for anyone to stumble upon by accident, but I still took precautions. My first thought was that maybe an animal had pushed its way in. A bear, maybe, or even a raccoon. I stepped out of the truck, grabbing the flashlight from the glove compartment before making my way up the steps. The wooden boards groaned under my weight, and as I pushed the door open the rest of the way, I immediately knew something was wrong. The smell hit me first. It was thick, cloying, heavy with rot. The kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and makes your stomach twist before your brain even registers what it is. I had smelled dead animals before, but this was different. Worse, I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over the small living room. Nothing looked disturbed at first. The couch was still in its place. The small wood stove in the corner was cold, and the kitchen area seemed untouched. But as I moved further in, The beam of my flashlight caught something dark near the floor. I stopped. At first, my brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. They were lying on their side near the doorway to the bedroom, their back facing me. I could see the dried, almost black pool of blood beneath them, the way their clothes were stiff with it. The skin on the back of their neck was mottled bluish, the way flesh turns when it starts to decay. I took a step back without realizing it, my boots scuffing against the wooden floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. I hadn't seen their face yet. I didn't want to. I forced myself to move, circling around slightly, just enough that the light caught more of them. It was a man. His arms were twisted in an unnatural way, one tucked beneath him, the other stretched out, fingers curled like claws. His face, what was left of it, was bloated, the skin discolored and peeling in some places. His eyes were open. I turned away, swallowing hard. My mind was scrambling, trying to piece together how this had happened, who he was, how he got here. I hadn't been to the cabin in over a month. Had he been here all that time? The weather had been cold, but not cold enough to stop decay. I needed to call the police. My hand went to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. No service. Of course, there was never service up here. I had to get back to the truck, drive down until I could get a signal. I turned toward the door, but then something made me stop. The door hadn't been forced open. The lock wasn't broken. Had I left it unlocked last time? No, I was sure I hadn't, which meant someone had a key, or they had locked the door behind them when they left. I turned back toward the body, my heart pounding. If this man had been murdered, then someone had been here with him. Someone had put him here. Someone had left him, and they could still be out there. I grabbed the old hunting rifle from the wall, my hands shaking as I checked the chamber. Loaded. I moved toward the door carefully, stepping outside onto the porch. The rain had stopped, but the mist still clung to everything, making the trees look like dark, shifting shapes in the night. I listened. Nothing. Just the usual sounds of the woods. The occasional drip of water from the trees, the distant call of an owl. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I locked the door behind me before making my way to the truck. My boots squelched in the mud as I climbed in, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the narrow path ahead. I drove faster than I should have, the truck bouncing over potholes, mud spraying up against the sides. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. It took almost 20 minutes before I got to a spot where my phone picked up a signal. I pulled over, hands fumbling to dial. The police arrived an hour later. I had to lead them back up, the rain starting again as we made our way up the narrow road. When we got back to the cabin, they found exactly what I had seen. The man, still lying there, the blood long dried beneath him. They asked me questions, a lot of questions. Did I know him? No. Had I seen anything suspicious? No. Did I leave the door unlocked? No. They took statements, took photos. Eventually, they moved the body. A few days later, I got a call. The man had been dead for at least 3 weeks. No ID, no phone, nothing on him to say who he was. But the strangest part? No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. It was like he had just walked in, laid down and died. But I knew better. Someone had put him there, and I still don't know if they ever left. I was 26 when I decided to spend a week at my uncle's cabin. It was deep in the woods, a long drive from town, and even longer from anything that resembled civilization. My uncle, James, had owned the cabin for years, using it as a hunting retreat. I had only been there a handful of times as a kid, but I remembered the place well: solid wooden walls, the scent of old pine, and the way the trees stretched tall and thick around the property, swallowing it in shadow even during the day. James had always been the kind of man who preferred solitude. He rarely spoke about the cabin, but when he did, there was always a certain tone in his voice, like he was holding something back. When I mentioned I wanted to get away for a while, clear my head, he hesitated. But after a long pause, he finally agreed and tossed me the key. "Just be careful," was all he said before walking off. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path, and by the time I pulled up in my truck, the sun had already dipped low behind the trees. The place looked the same as I remembered: weathered wood, a small porch, a pile of chopped firewood stacked up against the side. It was quiet, not even the usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and read an old book I had brought along. There was no cell service, which was expected, but it still felt strange being so cut off from the world. Outside, the forest was thick and dark, the trees pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was peaceful, but something about the silence made it feel wrong. The second day, I explored the woods a bit, following an old trail I had used as a kid. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees here were thicker, the air heavier. I spotted an old deer stand my uncle had built years ago, the wood rotting and splintered. It hadn't been used in a long time. I wondered when the last time James had come out here was. Then I found something strange. Half buried in the dirt near the base of a tree was a rusted hunting knife. The blade was dull and stained with something dark. Old blood? I didn't know. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands before tossing it back. Probably just an old tool my uncle forgot. That night, the unease deepened. I had locked up, made sure the windows were secure, but I still felt watched. Lying in bed, I listened to the quiet, to the faint creaks of the cabin settling. Then I heard something else: soft footsteps outside. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, deliberate. I sat up, my heart hammering. The footsteps moved along the side of the cabin, stopping near the front porch. I reached for the old hunting rifle my uncle kept in the cabin, gripping it tightly. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, then nothing. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe an animal, even though I knew it wasn't. By the third day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to hike out to a small lake a few miles from the cabin, thinking fresh air and movement might help clear my head. The path was overgrown, like no one had used it in years. The trees pressed in closer, the air thick and humid. I reached the lake by midday, its surface smooth and undisturbed. That's when I saw them, deep in the tree line, just at the edge of my vision. A figure. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew someone was there. I stood frozen, staring. Then, just as quickly as I had noticed them, they were gone. I rushed back to the cabin, my heart pounding the whole way. By the time I got inside and locked the door, I was out of breath. My hands shook as I reached for the rifle, keeping it close. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jolt awake. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my bag. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Someone had been here. The firewood stack was disturbed, logs scattered across the ground. The front door was covered in deep scratches, like something had tried to claw its way inside. My truck tires were slashed. I gripped the rifle tighter, scanning the woods. Nothing. I was stranded. I went back inside, barricading the door. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest road was miles away, and walking out alone didn't feel like an option. The day dragged on in tense silence. I checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded. As night fell, the air grew heavy. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then the doorknob rattled. I raised the rifle, my hands slick with sweat. The door shook as something pressed against it. I held my breath. Then silence. Minutes passed. Hours. When morning came, I forced myself to open the door. The scratches were worse, deep grooves cutting into the wood. I needed to leave. I packed what I could carry, slinging the rifle over my shoulder. I set off down the trail, moving quickly, eyes scanning the trees. Every crunch of leaves made my pulse spike. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I moved faster, heart pounding, lungs burning. The trees blurred around me. Then, just as the path opened up to the main road, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. They didn't move, they just watched. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, breath ragged, legs shaking. When I finally made it back to town, I told my uncle everything. He listened, his face unreadable. Then, after a long silence, he nodded. "You were smart to leave," was all he said. I never went back. I took the job because I needed the money. Simple as that. It wasn't like I had a dream of spending weeks alone in the mountains, looking after a rich man's hunting cabin. But the offer was good: watch over the place, keep an eye on the generator, make sure no one tried to break in, and in return, I'd be paid more in a month than I usually made in 3. It was late October when I drove up Garrison Ridge, an isolated stretch of wooded land in Montana. The property was tucked deep into the trees, miles away from the nearest paved road. The owner, a businessman from California, only used it during hunting season and wanted someone to keep it in shape until he arrived. He left behind enough supplies to last me the month, including canned food, bottled water, and a rifle in case of wild animals. The drive up was rough. The dirt road was barely wide enough for my truck, and rain from the previous night had turned sections of it into thick mud. I had to take it slow, watching for deep ruts that could wreck my tires. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was bigger than I expected. A sturdy, 2-story structure made of thick logs, with a wraparound porch and a detached shed about 20 yards away. The windows had thick wooden shutters, and there was a large stone fireplace inside. The owner hadn't spared any expense. This was no basic hunting shack. It was a retreat, a place meant for comfort as much as survival. I parked the truck and grabbed my bags, stepping onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and old fabric, with a faint trace of gun oil. A large bear rug lay sprawled in front of the fireplace, its mouth frozen in a permanent snarl. I spent the next hour checking the place over. The generator was in the shed, already filled with fuel. The water pump was working fine, and the food supplies were stacked neatly in the kitchen. There was even a small radio on the counter, though I doubted I'd get any stations this far out. By the time I finished, the last of the daylight had faded, and the woods outside had turned into a wall of darkness. I locked the doors, lit the propane lantern, and heated up a can of chili. The only sounds were the crackling of the lantern and the distant call of an owl. The first night was uneventful. I slept lightly, waking at every creak and groan of the cabin. It was the kind of place where silence pressed in on you, making even the smallest noise seem louder than it should be. The next few days passed without incident. My routine was simple: wake up, check the generator, eat, and take short walks around the property. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, it was a nice break from the noise of town. But on the fourth night, something changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window. The wind had picked up earlier, and trees had a way of making strange noises in the dark. But as I lay there, I realized the sound was too precise, too deliberate. Top, top, top. It came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen door. I sat up, heart pounding. The lantern was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I listened, straining to hear past the silence. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe an animal brushing against the side of the cabin. I settled back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. Then it came again. Top, top, top. This time it was louder, closer. I grabbed the rifle from beside the bed and crept toward the kitchen. My breath felt too loud, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shutters were closed, but I could feel someone on the other side of the door. I stood there, gripping the rifle, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to check. I unbolted the door and yanked it open, stepping onto the porch. My breath came out in a cloud of steam. The night was still, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze.
No footprints.
No sign of anyone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the darkness. My skin crawled, but there was nothing I could do except lock the door and try to sleep. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched never left. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, a shadow slipping between trunks, just out of sight. At night, the tapping returned, sometimes on the kitchen door, sometimes on the walls of the cabin. Always slow, always deliberate. I stopped sleeping. I kept the rifle loaded and within arm's reach at all times. Every noise made me jump. I started walking the perimeter more often, looking for tracks, but the ground was too packed to leave anything clear. Then, on the 9th day, I found something. Behind the shed, where the trees thickened, the underbrush had been disturbed. Branches snapped, leaves scattered. At first, I thought it was from deer or maybe a bear, but then I saw them, thin wooden figures hanging from the trees. They were crudely made, sticks tied together with twine shaped like small people. There were dozens of them, swaying gently in the breeze. Some were hanging at eye level. Others were high up, tied to branches I couldn't reach without climbing. I stood there, rifle gripped tight, stomach twisting. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I turned and sprinted back to the cabin, locking the doors behind me. I needed to leave. The problem was my truck wouldn't start. I tried for nearly an hour, turning the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't catch. The gas tank was full. The battery was fine. There was no reason for it not to start, unless someone had tampered with it. That night, I sat in the cabin with every light on, the rifle across my lap. The tapping didn't come, but something worse did. A slow, dragging sound. It started near the shed and moved toward the cabin, heavy and deliberate. Leaves crunched, twigs snapped. Something was moving in the dark, just beyond the treeline. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the rifle so tightly my fingers ached. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste time. I packed my bags, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't stop, didn't look back. It took me 8 hours to reach the nearest road. A trucker picked me up and drove me into town. I never went back for my truck. The owner called a few weeks later, saying the cabin had been broken into. Whoever did it left no footprints, no fingerprints, just more of those hanging wooden figures. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't be taking another job like that again. I never thought much about my uncle's old cabin until I had no choice but to stay there. It was deep in the mountains, far from any town, with no phone signal and no nearby neighbors. My uncle used to live there full-time, but after he passed, the place just sat empty. No one in the family wanted it, and no one ever visited. It was too far, too isolated, and had no modern comforts. But when I lost my job and needed somewhere to stay while figuring things out, the cabin was my only option. I told myself it was temporary, a couple of months at most, just until I got back on my feet. I packed up my things and drove out there in early October. The mountains were beautiful, covered in orange and yellow leaves. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, barely drivable, with deep ruts and loose rocks. My truck struggled up the incline, tires slipping more than once. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. Small, worn down, with dark wood siding and a sagging roof. The porch had a few broken boards, and the windows were coated in dust. My uncle never cared much for maintenance. I stepped inside, and the place smelled like old wood, dust, and something stale, like air that hadn't moved in a long time. The furniture was still there. A small table, a couple of chairs, and an old couch covered with a sheet. In the corner sat the wood stove, rusted but still functional. I set my bags down and got to work. The first thing I did was check the generator out back. It was an old gas-powered one, and luckily, my uncle had left some fuel in a metal drum. It took a few tries, but I got it running, and the cabin lights flickered to life. For the next couple of hours, I cleaned up. I wiped down the counters, swept the floor, and made sure the doors and windows were secure. There was no cell service, so I set up my old radio for news and weather updates. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the wood stove, and the cabin felt a little less abandoned. The first couple of nights were quiet. The woods were still, apart from the occasional sound of an owl or the rustling of branches. But by the third night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things, like how the woods around the cabin felt too quiet sometimes, how the trees outside the window looked different, like something had moved them. Then there were the noises. At first, I thought it was animals. The woods were full of them, but these sounds weren't normal. They weren't the distant howls of coyotes or the scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. One night, I heard something walking around the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned off the lights and looked outside, but I saw nothing. Another night, I woke up to a sound near the porch. A heavy creaking, as if someone had stepped on one of the loose boards. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. Silence. I told myself it was just the wind. But wind doesn't sound like footsteps. The feeling of being watched started to get to me. During the day, I felt fine. But as soon as the sun went down, that unease returned. One afternoon, I went to check the perimeter of the cabin. There were fresh tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They circled the cabin and then disappeared into the woods. I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. That night, I locked every door and window. I kept my shotgun close. I barely slept. The following day, I hiked down to the truck, planning to drive into town for supplies and maybe even think about leaving for good. But when I reached the truck, something was wrong. The hood was open. The engine had been tampered with. Someone had been here, and they didn't want me to leave. I grabbed my shotgun and scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of who had done it. I had no choice but to go back to the cabin. That night was the worst. I stayed up, listening, waiting. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and steady. Then something knocked on the door. A single, deliberate knock. I didn't move. Another knock. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, gripping my shotgun, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the noises stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I grabbed my gear and started walking. If I couldn't drive out, I'd hike. It was miles to the nearest road, but I wasn't staying in that cabin another night. I walked for hours, constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, I made it to the main road. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver gave me a ride to town. I never went back to the cabin. Later, I sent someone to tow my truck, and they found the cabin's door wide open. The furniture was overturned. The bed had been stripped. Whoever had been watching me had gone inside after I left. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know how long they had been there. All I know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all.